Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know what to say, if good morning or good afternoon, so we're going to leave it at that. Welcome. Of course, we're very grateful with you for coming to our event. We have a fantastic duo of academicians here, Mr. Funk from Chile and Mr. Hector Schamis from Washington. Okay. Let us say that history does enjoy irony. And we're certainly in an ironic moment. Across the world, populist movements are on the rise. Great Britain voted to exit the European Union because of anti-elite sentiment, and popular parties are surging in France, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, and elsewhere. And do I even need to mention Donald Trump? But there is the irony. Even as those bulwarks of traditional technocratic government, like the Nordic state and the Netherlands, move towards a more populist model in Latin America, good government rule is on the rise. Populism is actually in decline in Latin America at a time when it is rising elsewhere. This is truly startling. The versus populism is not limited to one Latin American country. It's occurring across the region. Consider recent events. Bolivians rejected a referendum that would have extended the rule of populist Evo Morales. In Peru, the daughter of disgraced dictator Alberto Fujimori was defeated in the presidential election by an economist. In Argentina, after more than a decade of ruinous Peronist rule, a center-right reformer is in charge. And in Brazil, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff has brought a constitutional lawyer to the presidency. And even in Venezuela, Maduro might be teetering on the edge. Clearly, change is afoot. And I'm hopeful that a new wave of truly democratic governance is sweeping the region. And this may also be a good time for the United States finally to begin re-engaging with Latin America, which it has ignored for too long. To discuss this topic, we have a superb duo of professors, Dr. Roberto Funk, Professor of Political Science at the Institute for Public Affairs of the University of Chile. And we're also joined by our old friend, colleague, and brother of these journeys, Dr. Hector Schamis, professor at Georgetown University. I want to express our thanks to Ms. Rachel Cox, the Director of Public Events here at Hudson, and to Sylvia Webel, the Center's Executive Assistant. And without any further ado, Roberto.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Also, it's great to be here. It's great to be in Washington. It's great to be away from the smog of Santiago in winter. Although, maybe you overdid it a bit. Let me see if I can. Great. So I'm going to, following up on what the ambassador said, very briefly provide a bit of data. I'll try to go quickly so we have some time for a discussion, and try not to sort of bore you with too many numbers. I'm a bit less optimistic than the ambassador regarding the sort of the shift away from populism in Latin America. Everything he said, of course, is true, but certainly from a Chilean perspective, if you look at what's going on, maybe that taints my optimism somewhat. It could be the smog. But historically, as you know, we've tended to look at Latin America, both from North America and in Latin America, with a certain what we call in political science cleavages, right? These sort of these dichotomies: there's the left to right, the north to south, the rich to poor, upper class, lower class, public private, state market, right? And I get the sense that in Latin America, and also in the cases in Europe that the ambassador mentioned, those cleavages are becoming less relevant and are being replaced with a new cleavage. So we've thrown those out, and the question is, what is that going to be? What are those cleavages going to be replaced with? Left-right doesn't make any that much sense anymore in Latin America, right? I mean, and it's interesting, in the ambassador's introduction, he didn't mention the left, he mentioned populism, because it's not really the same kind of thing that it was what we knew during the Cold War. So what's this going to be replaced with? And I think there's a few indicators if you look at both what's happening in Europe and what's happening in Latin America, and if you look at the numbers. So as I was saying, historically, and certainly in the last, from about 1998 to about 2010, everybody was talking about the rise of the new left. And there was the good left and the bad left. Castañeda talked about the good left and the bad left, which wasn't maybe the best way of looking at it, but it was one way of looking at it. And then after 2010, we started getting Piñera, we started getting Santos in Colombia, and we started getting some parties of the right. And that's continued, as Ambassador mentioned, in Argentina, in Peru. We'll see what happens in Brazil. So where I perhaps differ from the ambassador is the idea that somehow people are voting in favor, or people are rejecting populism. I'm not sure that that's happening. I think that what's happening is that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, people were voting for these leftist populist parties because they were rejecting what was before, which was the sort of market reform. They were beginning to be disappointed with the fruits of the democratization process. And basically voting against the status quo and voting against, to some degree, institutions. And then with the next wave, when people started voting for the right, what they were doing was voting against the status quo, which was the left. So I think what we're really seeing, to some degree, both in Latin America and in Europe, is anger. And The Economist devoted the last week or the week before, a lot of ink to the idea that we're talking now about the politics of anger. But it's also, and this is interesting for Latin America, it's an angry middle class. And that's something new in Latin America. And that's why we don't get this, the left-right thing doesn't make sense anymore, because maybe 30 years ago, in the 1960s, it was an angry peasant class or an angry workers' class. And now it's an angry middle class. So let's look at some numbers. Well, according to the World Bank, if you look at the last 20, this only takes us to 2010, so that would be, over 15 years, the group in Latin America that increased the most was the middle class. Now, how did the World Bank define the middle class? They say people that make between $10 and $50 a day. Middle class is notorious. I think sociologists base their careers on trying to define what the middle class is, but there's one definition. Okay, and certainly this is it's pretty clear when you see that kind of increase that that's going to cause some sort of shift, political, social shift in the region. This is interesting because that's based on income. Then if you ask Latin Americans, what do you consider yourself? Do you consider yourself wealthy, poor, or middle class? That's also increased. That's a breakdown by country. And the last line there is the Latin American average, which is almost 40%. So if you think of certainly what our, say, North American image or stereotype might be of Latin America, it's not middle class, right? And yet almost half of Latin Americans consider themselves to be middle class. I think that's important because what that does is, and I think this is the crux of my argument, is it creates expectation. One of the things that's happened, and it goes arm in arm with middle class, is increased access to higher education. If you compare three regions, in Europe, access to higher education over a 4 or 5 year period, it basically stayed the same. In the United States, it increased a little bit. In Latin America, it's increased quite a bit. And in Chile, in particular, it's increased a lot. This is important because, as you know, in Chile, much of the political reform that's going on starts from a series of demands that were made by university students in 2011 forward. So the increased access to education in Chile has translated into, or is somehow a vehicle for, on the one hand, more political demands, and on the other hand, more expectation, right? If you go to university, you expect to get a job, and you expect, in the case of Chile, to pay off your student loans, or the United States for that matter. But it's not a joke, because that's, again, one of the cruxes of this thing is, it's great to go to university. It's not great if you're going to be in debt for the rest of your life. It's only great to university if that has some sort of value added in what you're doing. This is a GDP growth, basically showing how, obviously that big dip is the crisis, right, in 2008, 2009, but what you see there is how Europe and Latin America have begun to come together in terms of GDP. Another little nugget that helps explain things is if you look at inequality in Latin America over the last, 10 years, 15 years, basically flat. It's gone down a little bit in Latin America. In the United States, the red line below is the United States, absolutely flatlined. That also explains what's happening here, right? And it explains what's happening in Latin America. In Latin America, we've been much more successful at reducing poverty than reducing inequality. That's why we have this increased middle class, but we have not reduced inequality. That has an impact on expectations. Here we start to see some signs of trouble, right? How happy are Latin Americans or different regions with democracy? And Latin America, even less than Africa, has confidence in democracy. 37% compared to 70% in Asia, 59% in Europe. Okay? So that's a sign of some worry. If you look at presidential approval ratings, there's a lot of numbers here, you can't see them, but what I'll do here is show you, this is from 2002, 2015, and what the numbers that are circled there are sort of the peaks of presidential approval in all these countries in Latin America. And after that peak, it starts going down. So what you see is low approval for democracy, lowering presidential approval across the board, with two notable exceptions in 2015, which are Bolivia and the Dominican Republic. But everywhere else, presidential approval has gone down over the last 5 or 10 years, consistently. And in Chile, that number there for Chile says 49%. The last poll came out on Monday. President Bachelet has 22% approval. We're heading towards the Peruvianization of presidential approval in Chile.
You wish. You wish, given stability in Peru.
The stability.
Stability.
Yeah. No, but I'm talking about presidential approval. Here I'm going to show you some bad news, and then I'm going to show you some good news. This is trusted institutions in Latin America. Where's this? Wait a minute. In Latin America, yeah. From 1995 to 2015, over 20 years, all the major political institutions, trust goes down. Okay? That's clearly a problem. We know what the relationship is between trust and political stability and support for democracy and so on. What institutions start to go up? If you add the private sector, slight increase, and banks, quite a bit of increase. So trust in political institutions goes down. And from a Chilean perspective, this is interesting because what's happened over the last 5 or 10 years, and the Bachelet government has responded to this, is the idea that the system, this proves that the system has collapsed. This proves that people are unhappy with neoliberalism, unhappy with market reform, and so on. What you see, and this is aggregate for Latin America, is that it's not quite so clear, right? The fact that Bachelet is unpopular, or any other president is unpopular, or that political parties or Congress are unpopular, doesn't necessarily mean that if you add in what trust in certain institutions, market institutions are, you get a sense that it's not quite as black and white. Now, but it's clear that there's anger. Again, if you're middle class, and this is basic modernization theory from the 1950s, which has been so discredited, but right, the idea is if you're middle class, you have a greater stake in the economy, a greater stake in society, and therefore you're going to support democracy more because you want. And you're going to be really angry when there's corruption, right? Because you get a sense that corruption is stealing from you. These two gentlemen here are two politicians in Chile, both of whom, of the main party of the right, the UDI, both of whom have been accused of corruption and are under some degree of house arrest. This is across the board in Chile. We can talk about that later in the discussion as to why this is going on. It seems like a bad thing. I think it's not a bad thing. There's anger and people have taken to the streets. Chile is, a clear example, but Brazil, we've had massive demonstrations. Argentina's always had demonstrations, but it doesn't really seem to matter very much. But there is a sense that, and this is noteworthy in a region where historically kind of social movements have been oppressed to some degree, there is a sense that people are really angry and taking to the streets to demand change. That's bad in a way because it means that we're not really. When people take to the streets, it's because the political channels for political demands are not available or not being chosen for different reasons. So that's bad. On the other hand, there's some positive signs there too, which we can talk about. So what's the bad news? The bad news is that clearly in a lot of countries in the region, particularly Chile, there seems to be less stability. There seems to be less stability. We were used to Chile. When I did my PhD, my supervisor said, "Why are you studying Chile? It's so boring." This was 21 years ago. It's so boring. You should study Mexico. Mexico's interesting. Well, now, unfortunately, this is like the Chinese curse, right? You should live in interesting times. Unfortunately, we're living in interesting times in Chile. So there is less stability. And we know that lack of trust in institutions is related to things like the strength of democracy. There is less trust because of corruption. All these things come to light. This kind of instability makes continued reform, the deepening of market reforms. In Chile, we don't really need the deepening of market reforms, and the rest of the region we probably do. Makes it much more difficult, right? It's no longer as perhaps as popular. And all of this, and this is absolutely key, and I think this is really what's going on, also with the changes that the ambassador mentioned, is the end of the commodity super cycle, right? Venezuela clearly, besides its own internal political problems and the contradictions of its own system, what supported or what hid those contradictions was the price of commodities. Well, that's no longer there. The same is true in Brazil. The country of the future was only the country of the future as long as it had access to this money. And Chile is also the case. Well, what's the good news? I try to end on a good note. The fact that there's corruption has come to light, can be seen as the fact that the corruption cases in Chile that have come to light, and the corruption cases in Brazil, which, by the way, make I would say Chile's mediocre even for corruption. In terms of corruption, we're kind of, if you compare us to Brazil. They're not new. That's basically the way the system always worked, but they're coming to light. And they're coming to light because there's more transparency, because people have more, there are more demands for information, there's more access to information, there's social networks, people know more. And that causes more anger, but it also, in the long term, if we survive the next few weeks, months, in the long term, will make for better political systems, right? So the electorate, the population, is much more demanding, much more involved than perhaps what we thought some years ago. The second bit of good news is that the numbers show to some degree that people are not rejecting the model, they're not rejecting capitalism. In Chile, we've had 5-6 years of student demonstrations regarding particularly education. No one is saying nationalize all the private universities. What they're saying is, protect us, regulate it. We don't want to go into debt for the rest of our lives. We don't want to study Patagonian tourism because some university thought it would be a good idea to offer a course in Patagonian tourism. So if you look at what they're saying, they look like they're left-wing sort of radicals demanding change. They're actually consumers demanding to be protected from a market that's not well regulated. That's really what's going on. They don't say it that way. They say, they have a Che Guevara on the T-shirt, but they're consumers asking to be protected from a market that's not well regulated. And if you look at, and I think, and this is where the middle class argument is important. People are not rejecting the model. People want into the model. People want to be part of the system. They want to have credit cards and want to have... The reason that we have 1 million students in the higher education system in Chile that have gone into debt is because their families are able to go into debt. And their grandparents did not have access to credit. So that's the middle class, right? That's what's happening. It's not that we've shifted to the left. It's that we've shifted towards having more people being part of the system and wanting to be really having a stake in it. This is just one example of this is a Chilean, or this is already quite an old poll from 2012, but it gives you some idea. If you ask Chileans, does this work? Yeah. If you ask Chileans, what do you need, what's required to get ahead in life? What doesn't, okay. The top answer, and more so in 2012 to 2010, may have gone down a bit, but the top answer is education. It's not state help, it's not public programs, it's education. What's the number 2? Work. Number 3, personal initiative. These are not the answers of people who are demanding that the country become, Bolivarian. These are people who want to be, I always say this kind of ironically, people on the street in Chile are demanding that Chile become as socialist as the United States. Right? So the United States has a huge public education system. That's what they want. They don't want Venezuela, they want it to be like the United States. And so basically, the coming cleavage is not left-right, it's not whatever, it's inclusion. It's between people who feel, and this is true, I think, in Britain and here with Trump and so on. If you look at the people who support Trump, they're people who feel like they've been left out of the new society, of globalization, so it's people who are in versus people who are out. And so the public policy, rather than thinking of we need more public whatever, should be thinking about how do you integrate this new middle class? How do you make them feel protected? How do you make them feel part of the market system? And how do you convince them that sometimes there is exclusion? I have an argument with my students at the university who say, marks, grades, you call them grades, Canadians call them marks. Grades are exclusionary because some students will be left out if they don't have good enough grades. And because there's the level of inequality, and there's actually literature on this, right? If you in a country that has a lot of inequality, grades will somehow be a product of that inequality, not necessarily of the student's ability. And there's some truth to that. But does that mean that a elite university like the one I work in should therefore get rid of any kind of admissions considerations because we need to fix that? Or do you fix the system with early childhood education? Do you throw money at those things so that by the time those students get to university, there's a more level playing field, right? So The question is, how well do you explain exclusion and make sure that there is a level playing field? And to finish, there was a sort of an implicit question in the title of this panel, which was, what's the role for the United States here? And I think that's the role for the United States, right? The United States, for all the troubles that it's going through now, its genius to some degree is having been able to explain, first to provide the idea of inclusion. Could be more true than or less true, we could have that argument, but there's the idea of inclusion, and also is good at explaining how and why some people don't make it to the top, right? The United States, in terms of its foreign policy towards Latin America, it seems to me, has more to offer in that area in terms of providing a model for this new cleavage, which is inclusion-exclusion, than the kinds of relationships. We've got, for the most part, we've got trade. Chile has free trade with the United States. That's done. We now need a new kind of relationship with the United States, which is based on a social model, not just an economic model. Thank you.
Don Hector.
In Spanish?
Don Hector.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, in Spanish. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Ambassador Daremblum, my good friend Jaime, for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to be here. Although this is the first time I'm here because whenever I was at Hudson, it still was on 15th Street before. I'm going to try to, reflect on the invitation with the sort of two issues that the invitation contains, changes in Latin America, opportunity for the U.S., address some of the issues Robert was talking about, like abolish the GPA, if there are any students here, that's what's going on in Chile apparently, abolish the GPA, and many other places, and then try to sort of have perhaps a forward-looking view on what's going on in Latin America and in the hemisphere as a whole. I have some notes here. I don't have transparency, I don't have a PowerPoint. But if I had one, it would be something like this. Just try to imagine this. It would be the old and simple 2x2 chart. And on one axis, it would be free market capitalism, and on the other axis, it would be liberal democracy. And how those two have combined in Latin America since the transitions of the 80s, last one being Chile in 1989 precisely, has been the issue of Latin American political and economic development ever since. And with that in mind, I think we could map what has happened in Latin America in terms of trajectories of individual countries, in terms of how much open market capitalism they have had and how much liberal democracy they have had over the last 3-4 decades. Apropos of that, I have to say, Robert, the people say that they're unhappy with democracy. Well, obviously, they would say that the younger they are, because that's a question that implicitly makes you think about a non-democracy. Exactly, a non-democracy. Now, if you're under 35 in Latin America today, or in the Southern Cone, you don't know what is non-democracy. So you are unhappy with your government, you're unhappy with politics, not with democracy necessarily. You're unhappy with the way the world works. So in a way, that's a healthy response. It's not necessarily the right question, and that's why I never did, polls in my life, because I'm not a fan of polls, you can tell. On that note, there is a lot of change going on in Latin America. I don't know if there is a trend, though, in terms of, I'm going to sort of avoid using terms like left, right, populism, and all of that, because it confuses us more than anything else. I've dropped those terms altogether for the most part. I'm going to say that some people say there is a change of cycle. some people have talked about crisis in Latin America. Crisis is a funny term when there is no crisis. I've talked about regime change myself in some of my work recently, particularly in some countries. I think Argentina is going through a regime change, not just a switch of the pendulum, not just a new political cycle or something like that. We can expand that if you want. But I think that whatever is ending is the result of a booming commodity prices that Latin America hasn't seen ever. Terms of trade, good old Prebisch, terms of trade of Latin America hadn't been more favorable ever in a large number of countries. And in those who have been better than they have been in the last decade or so, you have to go back 60, 70 years. Say Argentina, it has had better terms of trade during the export boom of the early 20th century, but you have to go back there to find it. Countries like Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia never ever had better terms of trade. There's been a boom in international prices. That is the critical independent variable here. Critical because it has created many of the phenomena that Robert just addressed. The growth of middle class, the expansion of the middle classes, the access to credit, and a variety of other things, including political projects aimed at perpetuation in office, which has been new in Latin America. Civil or democratic, by the way. Civil or civilian or military governments. Military governments, and Juan Lins would have agreed with me, authoritarianism doesn't aim at perpetuation. Authoritarianism is a response at what they see as previous crisis, an attempt to normalize until the country is ready for democracy again. Let's put it that way. Authoritarianism is temporary, but some of the attempts at perpetuation we have seen, the ALBA countries for the most part, have been a new political project, financed by extraordinary terms of trade and commodity prices that allow them to build the patron-client networks with which elections were won. And if they weren't won, they were rigged, oftentimes. And that's the phenomenon of the new middle class, 75 million people coming into the middle class, many of them young, and then you have the anger having to do with generational issues. Wherever you go in the world, actually, Europe, the US, the Middle East, Latin America, you go down in age, and with every year you go down, unemployment rate increases. So if you are 25 university grad, and unemployed, which is a pretty large pattern in the world, in Europe, in Latin America, in the US, in the Middle East, by the way, what we see is that a recipe for tremendous dissatisfaction, and that will show, obviously. The youth today is far more educated and informed than their parents, and far more unemployed than their parents. That's a recipe for instability in and of itself. What's going on, I think, is that, well, Argentina has changed. It's sort of it's funny, the discussion, you know. I've dared to call my friends at PRO that they are center-left government. I've dared to tell them that, and some don't like it, some like it very much. Apropos your Macri being center-right. Brazil is a big mess. As we know, Bolivia has had a referendum where the president lost indefinite re-election. Watch out, Hugo Chavez also lost that referendum, but then they modified the indefinite re-election clause in Congress, in the Asamblea Nacional. I wasn't joking about Peru. I said that nobody talks, or we don't talk enough about Peru. It's been a dramatically important lesson of democratic stability and civic culture, what just happened, you know, in the last election. And there goes Peru with a good amount of political stability and a good amount of successful market capitalism, and an election that was under 0.4% difference. That is typically a recipe for disaster, and it didn't happen. A decent concession on the part of Keiko Fujimori and the new president, our good old friend Pedro Pablo, an IMF economist, World Bank economist, and many other places. There is an election in Ecuador in February. Correa said that he's not going to run, but we'll see if that happens. There is an election in Nicaragua next November. When you go to all the ballots, printed ballots competing, the candidate is the same, Daniel Ortega. That doesn't look too good. And there is peace in Colombia. Or there will be peace in Colombia. So add to that changes in Cuba, which may end up in democratic capitalism or may end up on authoritarian capitalism, following the Chinese, or if you want, given size more appropriately, the Vietnamese pattern of a Communist Party elite that manages to implement market reforms and introduce capitalism in order not to leave power, but to stay in power, even stronger. And of course there is Venezuela, the elephant in the room of our hemisphere, which is critical and tragic and extremely dangerous for the region as a whole. There's a massive exodus of women going into Colombia as we speak to buy food, if they can buy the food. Otherwise, they will be looting supermarkets and stores in Colombia, and that's it's a tragedy of epic proportion that I don't think, in general, we haven't come to terms in our debate with that, with some exceptions, and I'll address that in a minute. In that sense, I certainly have to commend Secretary General Almagro for having put the Venezuela issue as it is on the table, have called things for what they are. That's a dictatorial rule. There is no rule of law. There is a series of ruptures of the constitutional order, a legislature that cannot legislate, a judiciary that is packed with apparatchiks, political prisoners that are convicted with manufactured evidence, and a dramatic humanitarian crisis with little premature babies dying because incubators do not work, cancer patients dying because there are no drugs for treatment, and so on and so forth. And I think the good news is that gradually, slowly but surely, I do think what's going on at the OAS is hopeful, and it's the beginning of a return of principled debate in Latin America and in the region as a whole. And I'm saying that the case is dramatically important for its humanitarian tragedy and the effects that may have a refugees crisis in neighboring Colombia, neighboring Brazil as well, but also because it's a way of it's deception on the issues that brought about democracy as a whole in the continent. It's deception to the Democratic Charter. The Democratic Charter was written precisely because there were other forms of instability, and it was written after Peru when Fujimori closed down Congress and established a dictatorial rule. And then the region realized that, well, wait a minute, we used to have breakdowns because the military will come in, but now there are other forms of breakdowns. What do? Well, we need to write a document that allows us to intervene. An intervention doesn't mean the Marines, of course. The Venezuelan government talks about intervention all the time. Intervention is the bread and butter of human rights. Without intervention, there is no human rights. That is precisely the motivation for UN 1948. It's intervention. If we had the tools to intervene, to mediate, to censor, to sanction morally, the Holocaust wouldn't have happened, or would have happened in a different way. In a less tragic way. That is the motivation. So yeah, those are tools for intervention. What's going on in Venezuela is all of a sudden is, I also agree with this, it's not left or right because it doesn't matter. They can call themselves anything they want. I was once at Moisés Naim's show, and he asked me, he said, well, there is gobiernos de izquierda, left-wing governments. And on the spot, he called me, Vice President, and I said to Moisés, izquierda dirán ellos. Left, they would call themselves left. Look at poverty, inequality growing, lack of health, lack of food. What kind of, that's not in my book of what I read about, being left. So, left, they would say left. And all of this, and I couldn't say enough about the importance of coming to terms with Venezuela and intervening in Venezuela, intervening with mediation. Fernando Enrique Cardoso and José Serra went to Montevideo yesterday, and they sat down, none other than Fernando Enrique Cardoso sat down with the Uruguayan president and said, we don't want Venezuela to be presiding Mercosur, and that could be the beginning of change, now that Brazil is acting on Venezuela. We know very well that without Lula and Dilma, Maduro wouldn't be president today, most likely. And apropos, the right and left, that is Fernando Enrique Cardoso, none other. But since we don't know anymore what's right and left in Latin America, I'll suspend that. All of this in the context of what the meeting invites us to talk about, which is U.S. and U.S. foreign policy. And when I see what's going on, in the world and in the region, I can't help remembering Henry Kissinger's word that he used about the administration and its foreign policy a number of times, ambivalent. He said a couple of times in written form, and not long ago with Zakaria on CNN, he said that Obama's foreign policy has a tactical approach to foreign policy without any clear strategic purpose behind it. And it's in that sense ambivalent. And I think that's very pertinent with regards to the administration's foreign policy in Latin America as well, not just in the Middle East or in Europe. Because I would say as well, following Kissinger's steps, that that has been if you want, the trademark of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Very engaged in Cuba to produce change, for the most part in a way that I agree with. We don't know what's going to work in the future, but we do know that what we had so far didn't precisely work. So let's try something. Very engaged in Colombia, extremely engaged. And not much else in terms of engagement on the part of the administration. And interestingly enough, the arguments that you hear from the administration, from top diplomats and State Department officials and National Security Council officials is that, we can't be seen too involved because it's counterproductive. They say that publicly, they say that in private conversations. Why isn't it counterproductive, the level of engagement the administration has had in Cuba or in the Colombian peace plan? And then, when I sort of contrast the two, I can't help remembering Henry Kissinger's words, ambivalence. And that's an opportunity opportunities that are lost. I was at the OAS General Assembly in Santo Domingo a couple of weeks ago. I was there when Secretary of State Kerry spoke, and he gave a marvelous speech with covering all four bases. Recall referendum on Venezuela, recall referendum now, freedom of political prisoners, humanitarian aid, and what was the fourth? I don't remember, but okay, it had three bases, not four loaded, not all bases loaded. Well, U.S. therefore has a position. U.S. seems siding with the Secretary General on that. Yet that initial session of foreign ministers is over. 10 minutes later, you see the tweets that the Venezuelan government posted all over of a private meeting between the Secretary of State Kerry and the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Delcy Rodriguez. And then, yet again, ambivalence. After that speech, not that you will not meet, but is quite a contrast what you just said moments ago. I think that's an opportunity that may be lost, with lives lost and with the tremendous instability and a big risk for the rest of Latin America and for the hemisphere and the Inter-American system as a whole. If nothing else, in terms of that old principle that drove our transitions, which was the principle of human rights, none other than human rights. If we in Latin America had democratic transitions starting in 79 with Peru and ending in 89 with Chile, and you go through all the countries, Venezuela was the only democratic country in South America at the time, by the way. Life has reversed. It was because of the lesson that we learned in terms of human rights. And in terms of human rights, you don't have them if you don't have constitutional democracy, if you don't have separation of powers, checks and balances, and so on, independent judiciaries, and so on and so forth. Now, things are also unstable, perhaps, or uncertain, at least in the U.S. itself, in an election year, in an unprecedented election year. An election year that offers risks and opportunities at the same time. The one, aside from the hopes I have in terms of the outcome of that first Tuesday in November, the other hope I have will also give away what hopes I have, which is that the U.S. should not have less engagement, should have more. Along the lines of the kind of engagement the U.S. has had all these years in Cuba, producing political change. Whether that will translate into more democracy, well, we hope that, but it's up to the Cubans to make it happen, and I agree with that. The level of engagement it has had, and it continues to have in the Colombian peace process, a fundamental landmark in Latin American democracy if it ends well. But not trying it for sure will not make it end well. And having said this, I think that opportunities are enormous. We'll see if the U.S. is capable of going and pick up on those opportunities to help produce a change. Thank you very much.
Muy bien. Muy bien. We'll now enter into a third part of our event, and we're going to have our two main speakers to discuss any points that either of them feel that should be more amply discussed. Go ahead.
I have one comment regarding the ambivalence. I think there is some of that. I happen to think there's been a bit written about this, that Obama's foreign policy is actually extremely Kissingerian. It's realist, and the realism comes from recognizing the limits of American power, perhaps too much, perhaps to the. One thing is to kind of know thyself, and another thing is to tell the whole world just how limited the power is. But I think that's what's guided it more than lack of strategy. However, I think it is true that there's more than ambivalence. I think there's a lack of imagination in American foreign policy. I'll give one example, and I think it is a very worrying example. What kind of U.S. intervention can there be? A U.S. intervention, as Hector said, is not necessarily Marines. If you look at what's one of the tendencies that worries me a lot in Latin America is the introduction in recent years of media owned by foreign, not so friendly powers like Iran and Russia in Spanish. Iran has Hispan TV and Russia has RT in Spanish. And their editorial lines are appalling. But at least RT people know it's got an R in it. People know it is Russian. Hispan TV, most people don't know is Iranian. And they're funding a certain editorial line, which, aside from being anti-American, fine. A lot of people are anti-American, but and aside from being leftist, and for all that we say, well, we don't know what's left and right anymore. Watch Hispan TV, you'll know what's left. But I think that's very worrying. And basically what I'm getting at is that there's a kind of soft power that the United States could use. Now they would say, the other side would say, well, the United States has CNN, it's already got its CNN in Espanol, and there's all sorts of media controlled or owned by American interests in broadcasting to Latin America. But none of them have the kind of, they're for the most part fairly responsible and unbiased. I would be surprised if you spoke to a journalist from CNN. I don't know if there's any journalists here, but if you spoke to a journalist from CNN and said, we want you to toe the Obama foreign policy line, I can imagine what the response would be. Well, Hispan TV and RT do that. And really it's very regarding a series of issues that are really inflammatory, at least in the Chilean case, regarding the indigenous issues, regarding students. I think the United States has to watch out that it does not leave certain spaces unoccupied. China's coming in other areas, not so much in the media side, but I think that's one area where I would agree with Hector that foreign policy is a problem. Now, a further point, which I did not mention in my presentation, which is true in Chile, it's I think true in Argentina to some degree. For all the progress that we've made with democratization in Latin America, one area that has not improved an awful lot is the strength and institutionalization of political parties. Right? And there were a few countries that had strong party systems. One of them was Chile, and one of them, to some degree, was Argentina. It was one party, but had a strong party system. Two parties. In both those cases, and then we have countries which for a long time have not had strong parties, like Peru. And what's worrying is that what we're seeing, because of many of the phenomena that I highlighted, a kind of erosion of the party system that we're not really sure with what it will be replaced. And I think that's something to watch out for in terms of, that doesn't bode well for political stability in the future. Just those 2 points.
I should mention that Costa Rica has a good party system, and it's been there for a long, long time.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that little.
So good point.
Any questions? Any observations? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Ed Meyer, Cordial Worldox. Didn't a majority of the members of the OAS recently sign a statement or pass a resolution criticizing Secretary Almagro for exceeding his authority?
Well, that was the in commission. That was the initiative. what was voted was a completely different text. What was voted is that the Venezuelan delegation had made a proposal to discuss in the Permanent Council certain decisions by the Secretary General that exceeded his institutional obligations. And the vote was on that text. The vote wasn't on it. The vote was on the right of Venezuela to discuss, to bring to the Permanent Council. It was a redundant vote because every state member has the right to bring to the Permanent Council anything they want. But it was a way to translate that into that sort of electoral victory. When they went out to the press after the session, the foreign minister, Venezuelan foreign minister, said we had a tremendous victory censoring the Secretary General, etc., etc., etc. That was the exact sequence of events. Moreover, in the initial proposal, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nicaragua, and Bolivia had proposed to vote to ask for the resignation of the Secretary General. And they didn't have the votes for that, certainly. So they backtracked and they came out with this formula. That was redundantly a redundant vote. Now, a more interesting vote, I have to say, is that in the last session of the Permanent Council to discuss the document of Venezuela that Almagro had produced, the session started with the Venezuelan delegation proposing to eliminate the agenda, to knock down the agenda altogether, to reject la orden del día, as it goes. And that was a vote that they lost. And it's the first time they lost a vote at the OAS since Chavez. Apropos change of cycle.
Yeah.
The U.S. has primarily engaged with the governments of Latin American countries, and I'm curious, beyond the media example, how can the U.S. build relationships with the people themselves to facilitate or encourage political change in Latin America?
People.
You live in the South. I don't.
The people.
Popolo.
I think there's a lot to be done, and I always attend these 4th of July parties at the American Embassy, and you observe who's there. And I think the United States actually does a fairly decent job of engaging with civil society. They're very involved with, they try to engage with women's groups, with groups of sexual diversity, with environment groups. I mean, if you look at, I'm just looking at what I see, who I see at a party. This is extremely scientific. But I do get the sense that the United States is worried about reaching out to civil society. A lot of that involves money. I mean, it's not just inviting them to 4th of July, which, by the way, was catered by McDonald's, which I thought was very odd. But anyways, it's not just, you need to fund projects. But there's different kinds of projects. I mean, this is what I say. I said earlier, for a long time, relations with countries like Chile were geared towards trade and investment and so on, and that's important, and that's there, and it's working. There's a second tier or third level, or second or third level relations, which I think have to do with this kind of, exporting expertise, exporting society, exporting an idea, which went out of fashion, after the 1960s and 70s. But I think it's important, and I think there's certain idea that has to do with and it's the idea of liberal democracy. At the end of the day, right? It's the idea of if you're going to fund women's groups. If you choose the groups in civil society that you're going to fund, you're giving certain signals regarding what you support as a country and what your ideals are. And I think that it does a fairly good job of that, but maybe it needs to communicate it a bit better.
Funk. I was very interested in your comment.
I would appreciate that when asking a question, to identify yourselves and the affiliations.
Mark Materno, Interactivity Foundation. I was very interested in your remarks about capitalism and competition. The Latin Americans are not opposed to capitalism; they want competition. And and in your remarks about inequality, and I'm wondering whether you find that there's any type of a Latin American version of political correctness, like the sort that we see on our campuses and in our media, and that seems to have fueled a lot of the anger that many Americans are feeling about our political establishment. Do you find that there's something like that in Latin America, in Chile, in Argentina? And if so, what is it like, and how do you think that it has affected the politics there?
Well, 2 points. I'll get to the political correctness thing in a minute, but regarding competition, blueberries. If you buy blueberries here, at a certain time of year, chances are good they come from Chile. If you buy blueberries in Chile at the same time of year, which is summer there, so think about carbon footprint, right? Think about how long they had to travel to come to Whole Foods and how long they had to travel to get to the Jumbo down the street from my house. I took a picture. That's a picture I should put on here one day. A little thing of 125 grams of blueberries costs roughly, it ranges, but it can cost between $5 and $6. 125 grams. They're much more expensive in Chile than they are here, and they have to travel far less. Why is that? Why is that? Lack of competition. There are two main supermarket chains, and everybody knows that there is price collusion. When I talk about corruption, one of the big issues is actually, there's the issue of political corruption. One of the big issues has been price collusion. And there have already been some high-profile cases, and when you talk about that, we've been high-profile cases, and it sounds ridiculous, but chicken and toilet paper. The two main companies that produce, the two main pulp and paper companies, were colluding over the price of toilet paper. It's cheaper to shop for groceries, much cheaper to shop for groceries here than it is in Chile, and there's no reason for that aside from the lack of competition. So, and people know that. People know that, right? So the argument that the market's too small, which is the traditional argument you get from companies in Chile, that the market's small, so not enough people buy blueberries. Books are very expensive in Chile. Why? Amongst other things, because they charge value-added tax. If you go to Brazil, you don't pay value-added tax on Chile. Many other countries don't charge tax. So there's many examples like that. So people know that, and that's why they want more competition. Yes, there is political correctness. There was a BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, is becoming active. There was just a case at the University of Chile where they tried to boycott the presence of the Israeli ambassador to give a talk at the Faculty of Law. Finally, he did speak because the university, for the most part, which is the case in most areas in the world, where the students kind of try to stop things and the university says, well, this is free speech and it's an academic debate and so on. That's one case. For the most part, on the part of the left, there is, for example, even students in my faculty will become quite animated if you, I'll give you an example. I and some colleagues of mine at the University of Chile, and often in our teaching evaluations, we'll get comments saying the professor uses the United States too often as an example, as a case study, or there's a lack of diversity in theoretical approaches regarding, basically the theoretical approaches, the authors we use tend to be too not alternative enough, things like that. So that's beginning to be, but it's nowhere near the levels that we have here, partly because we also have a long way to go on the other side, right? We still need to have much more, and this has to be said, there's still a lack of respect in terms of interaction and language and so on regarding women and sexual minorities and racial minorities and class and religion and so on. So there's a kind of political correctness, but we have a long way to go still before we can go to the other extreme. Yeah.
Hector?
No, that's okay. Get more.
The lady in green.
Lady in green.
With the Interactivity Foundation. Thank you very much for your comments. I have a question to both speakers. It's in regards to Argentina. Could you please expand on your comments? You talked a little bit about erosion of party system in Argentina, and also you said that Argentina is going through a regime change. I wonder what you meant about that. Thank you.
Wait, you go first. That order.
Well, if you look at the two main parties were the Peronist Party and the Radical Party. The Peronist Party, we're not really sure what's going to happen there. There's some sort of internal struggle going on. And the Radical Party has teamed up with this right, left, center, up, down candidate, president. And what does he represent? What is this new coalition? It's a new thing the Radical Party really a long time ago lost its traditional role in the party system, and Peronism got sort of taken over by Kirchnerism. So we don't really know what was going to happen with Kirchnerism. She was in court yesterday, I believe, so we don't know. The traditional bi-party system in Argentina seems to be changing. Whether that's a change to the party system or regime change, I leave that to Hector.
Let me add a couple of things. First of all, political parties are in trouble wherever you go. The idea of a political party is gone. People don't like political parties. You go to every poll you can get your hands on about ranking social institutions, parties come to the very end, to the very bottom of the list. Police institutions, religious institutions, you name it, rank before in terms of social prestige, higher than political parties. Parties are in trouble everywhere. Parties are in trouble in this country, one of them in particular, as we know. So we need to figure out, at the same time, no parties, no democracy, but, we need to figure out that equation needs a resolution, either through a different type of organization, either through a different type of party organization, et cetera, et cetera. How bad the party system is in Argentina? Well, I don't know. I don't think it's that bad. Or a couple of things also about political parties. I praised strongly Peru's political stability and very handsome recognition, concession, and so on and so forth. Well, Peru has no party system, for example. Peru has, parties last for as long as the presidential term lasts. Toledo's presidency, Fujimori's presidency, you name it. APRA is the only party that still exists, but, we'll see what APRA will do post Alan Garcia, when Alan Garcia is retired from politics and so on and so forth. So maybe we don't need parties. We need something else. Now, what's going on in Argentina? Well, in terms of the party system, something interesting. Macri is the first president in a century that is not a Peronist, not a radical, and not a military. That's quite a change. Whether that a new party is here to stay, or whether that party will be a Peruvian party and then it's going to be a 4-year or an 8-year or whatever, and then it will disappear, and then there will be another Peronist. Well, perhaps, but Peronism loses elections now. And not only now. Peronism lost elections many, many times. So that, with regards to the beginning of a potential important transformation in the party system. The Radical Party is partner in a coalition, but as a weak partner, was in government in '99 with the La Rua, but the Radical Party was the big partner, the strong partner of that coalition. Now is the minor partner in the coalition. We'll see. It's all new. I also think, when I say it's a regime change, I wrote something 2 weeks ago. My column was on this in El País. It's never, ever happened. There's always been corruption in Argentina and elsewhere. In Latin America, in the world, there's always been corruption. Corruption in Latin America, to a large degree, because of the extraordinary inflow of foreign exchange having to do with the commodity boom, has taken a dramatically different quantitative dimension, which translated into a different qualitative dimension. Argentina, and not only Argentina, has had, I've called corruption a number of times as a political regime, as a system of domination, that to a great extent substitutes for weak parties and weakens parties even more, interestingly enough. Corruption, the networks of corruption have become power structures that control the state, that have captured, in a number of countries, have captured the state. Argentina comes out now, out of 12 years, the longest government ever, consecutive 12 years, of a husband and wife that also attempted to stay longer. I mean, now since people have very short memory in Argentina, nobody remembers that only 2 or 3 years ago, Cristina Kirchner's supporters used to say, Cristina Eterna. And the idea was to reform the constitution and pack the Consejo de la Magistratura, the institution that appoints judges, going in the direction of a third term, and didn't go anywhere. Partly because in 2013, the official party lost the midterm election and then didn't have enough seats to produce that. So in that sense, it's something very interesting is going on. The people who work on security, anti-corruption, and so on and so forth, find that the state apparatus has been captured by corruption rings. It's not anymore what used to be, well, some sort of, official in a public agency paying, adding a 20% to an invoice. It's not anymore a method of making quick fortunes. It's a system of domination with territorial control, with selection of leaders, and of course with the financing of campaigns that determines the political outcome itself, and oftentimes bypassing the traditional party structures. To a great extent, that is the core of the Brazilian crisis, as a system of institutionalized corruption, not for a person, not for a presidential couple, not for a family, say Nicaragua, but for a political party, the PT, which attempted to, as we say in the literature, well, the preization of PT in Brazil, sort of that party that it was a hegemonic party in power for 70-something years until 2000, right? Now in power again, but in a competitive system, a different type of regime. And in that sense, the kinds of challenges that political society faces amount to a regime change, to a political transition, a regime transition. How to extricate all these networks from state apparatus, which means from power. And it's tough. I mean, yeah, Cristina Kirchner is in court, people go to jail, monies are, found in monasteries and so on and so forth. Yeah, well, that's what it is. And all these people who are already in jail point in the direction of the key cabinet members of Nestor and Cristina Kirchner. By the way, whoever is in jail now were second in the line of command of key ministers of the previous governments. So it's a metaphor, but it's more than a metaphor in many ways.
One last question, and we go to the right this time. Yeah, you were asking to ask a question before. Please.
Gerald Chandler of iTech Consultants. Do you think that there'll be a continuing trend to integration between the U.S. and Central America and Mexico both ways? We have so many Americans retiring to those countries and so many people who have family histories from those countries. Do you think that will develop so far that we'll have effective integration between the countries?
Oh, and I may add, and Mexicans retiring in Mexico, which is the explanation for the immigration flow that candidate Trump doesn't know, obviously. The flow has been negative. More Mexicans have gone back to Mexico than Mexicans coming to the U.S., legally, illegally, any way you want. For the most part, because there's a whole generation of Mexicans in the U.S. that, with retirement, they go back to Mexico with their Social Security checks. More bang for the buck, as they say. Yeah, and also add, I would say, Pacific Alliance. Well, we haven't talked much about Pacific Alliance, was the new club that everyone wants to be a member of now, and including Argentina, and also where the U.S. has played. Well, that's a trade integration, but also speaks to, well, also that is, on the, there you have another example where the administration has had a tremendously active role in the Pacific Alliance, and should, therefore, part of these, contrasts.
I think it's interesting. The Pacific Alliance is a good example of how integration is changing, right? If you compare the meeting we had in Chile last week, which was a pretty good success, and the kinds of agreements that were reached. I mean, the Pacific Alliance, the genius of the Pacific Alliance is kind of it's more bottom up than top down in small steps. So some of the agreements were about sort of benefits to companies that integrate themselves within countries. For example, the mobile phone company Claro announced that it would not charge roaming fees between countries of the Pacific Alliance. So I think, if you compare that to the grand announcements of the late mid 1900s or early 1990s of the three amigos and the four amigos and free trade from Alaska to Patagonia and all these wonderful things which never materialized. The Pacific Alliance is really a new way of looking at it. I think we should. I'm happy to come back in 6 months and talk about the Pacific Alliance, but it's changing the way. First of all, it's changing the way that integration works. Secondly, the Pacific Alliance had a clear ideological, when it was founded, a clear ideological motivation, which was to counterbalance the sort of Bolivarian type of integration. It's been interesting to watch Michelle Bachelet and Heraldo Muñoz try to peg the round peg in a square hole because they don't really feel part of that project, and yet they are clearly integrationists, and particularly they've had, Heraldo Muñoz has had the idea of emphasizing Chile's relations with Latin America, and the Pacific Alliance is part of that. Counterbalancing that has been Argentina and Brazil, which were looked at this and said, oh my goodness, what's happening? We're being left out. Argentina is now participating more. Brazil has other problems at the moment. But I think what's interesting about all that is that if you look at the world, and clearly the world is going in the opposite direction. And people are worried about the European Union, of course, but also TPP and other things, and people are looking inward. The model of the Pacific Alliance of how it's progressing in terms of integration will be probably more relevant and more important.
It is. Well, everything has to come to an end, I guess. We thank you very much for having been with us this afternoon. We'll keep you posted on the following events, and I would suggest that we give a round of applause to our magnificent